despite the unreal, falsehoods of the anti-Semitism that I had read in the last videos, there's a sort of irony, and this isn't to be like, well, it's true, because it's absolutely not. In the last videos, all those were pretty much falsehoods or Christians secretly in control of it in the end. Anyways, there's an issue of colonialism, but it's still at the heart of things a Christian uh, colonial plot, as you will see. Um, it's actually very unfortunate because it almost makes it seem like it's circling back around with everything I just read. Um, alright, so how Britain destroyed the Palestinian homeland. 100 years since Balfour's Promise, Palestinians insist that their rights in Palestine cannot be dismissed. By Ramsey Burroud. When I was a child growing up in a Gaza refugee camp, I looked forward to November 2nd. On that day, every year, thousands of students and camp residents would descend upon the main square of the camp, carrying Palestinian flags and placards to denounce the Balfour Declaration. Truthfully, my giddiness was motivated largely by the fact that schools would inevitably shut down, and following a brief but bloody confrontation with the Israeli army, I would go home early to the loving embrace of my mother, where I would eat a snack and watch cartoons. At the time, I had no idea who Balfour was and how his declaration, and all those years ago, had altered the destiny of my family, and by extension, my life, and the lives of my children as well. All I knew was that he was a bad person, and because of his terrible deed, we decided we subsided in a refugee camp, encircled by a violent army and by an ever-expanding graveyard filled with martyrs. Decades later, destiny would lead me to visit the Wittenham Church, a small parish in which Arthur James Balfour is now buried. While my parents and grandparents are buried in a refugee camp, an ever-shrinking space under a perpetual siege and immeasurable hardship, Balfour's resting place is an oasis of peace and calmness. The empty meadow all around the church is large and enough to host all the refugees in my camp. The British movement remains unrepentant after all these years. It has yet to take any measure of moral responsibility, however symbolic, for what it has done to the Palestinians. Finally, I become fully aware of why Balfour was a bad person. Once Britain's Prime Minister, then the Foreign Secretary from late 1960s, Balfour had pledged my homeland to another people. That promise was made on November 2nd, 1917, on behalf of the British government in the form of a letter sent to the leader of the Jewish community in Britain, Walter Rothschild. At the time, Britain was not even in control of Palestine, which was still part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, I hope that this mentioning of Walter Rothschild isn't like a conspiracy within this article. Anyways, I'm trying to just be aware of any unironic Semitism that might be strewn about in the media. Alright. At the time, Britain was not even in control of Palestine, which was still part of the Ottoman Empire. Either way, my homeland was never Balfour's to so casually transfer to anyone else. His letter read, quote, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of the national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate to the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. End quote. He concluded, I should be grateful. Hold on. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. End quote. Ironically, members of the British Parliament have declared that the use of the term Zionist is both anti-Semitic and abusive. The British government remains unrepentant after all these years. It has yet to take any measure of moral responsibility, however symbolic, for what it has done to the Palestinians. Worse, it is now busy attempting to control the very language used by Palestinians to identify those who have deprived them of their land and freedom. But the truth is, not only was Rothschild a Zionist, Balfour was too. Zionism, then before deservedly became a swear word, was a political notion that Europeans prided themselves to be associated with. In fact, just because he became Prime Minister, David Cameron declared before the Conservative Friends of Israel meeting that he too was a Zionist. His successor, Theresa May, even celebrated the 100th anniversary of Balfour Declaration, quote, with pride. To some extent, being a Zionist remains a rite of passage for some Western leaders. Yeah, even Christians can be Zionist. I believe Biden recently declared he was, so that's something to look out for. Balfour was hardly acting on his own. True, the declaration bears his name, yet in reality he was a loyal agent of an empire with massive geopolitical design, not only concerning Palestine alone, but with Palestine as a part of the larger Arab landscape. Just a year earlier, another sinister document was introduced, albeit secretly. It was endorsed by another top British diplomat, Mark Sykes, and on behalf of France by Francois Georges Picot. The Russians were informed of the agreement as they too had received a piece of the Ottoman cake. The document indicated that once the Ottomans were soundly defeated, their territories, including Palestine, would be split among the prospective victorious parties. Of course, obviously this is still happening now, although it does seem like there's an ethnic cleansing at this point, a virtual one, which we will get to later on. All right. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, also known as the Asian Minor Agreement, was signed in a secret 102 years ago, 2 years into World War I. It signified the brutal nature of colonial powers that rarely associated land and resources with people that lived under the land and owned their resources. Yes, the Palestinians are definitely like below the caste system. They're not even in the framework. Okay. The centerpiece of the argument was a map that was marked with straight lines by China graph pencil. The map largely determined the fate of the Arabs, dividing them in accordance with various haphazard assumptions of tribal and sectarian lines. Once the war was over, the loot was to be divided into spheres of influence. France would receive areas marked A, which included the areas of southeastern Turkey, southern Iraq, including Mosul, most of Syria and Lebanon. British-controlled areas were marked with letter B, which included Jordan, southern Iraq, Haifa and Acre in Palestine, and a coastal strip between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan. Russia would be granted Istanbul, Armenia, and the strategic Turkey Straits. The improvised map consisted not only of the lines but also colors, along with language that attested to the fact that the two countries viewed the Arab region purely on materialistic terms, without paying the slightest attention to the possible repercussions of slicing up entire civilizations without a multifarious history of cooperation and conflict. The agreement read partly, quote, "In the blue area, France, and in the red area, Great Britain, shall be allowed to establish such direct or indirect administration or control as they desire, and as they think fit to arrange with the Arab state or confederation of the Arab state." The brown area, however, was designated as an international administration, the nature of which was to be decided upon further consultation among Britain, France, and Russia. The Sykes-Picot negotiation finished in March 1916 and were official, although secretly signed on May 19, 1916, World War I concluded on November 11, 1918, after which the division of the Ottoman Empire began in earnest. British and French mandates were extended over divided Arab entities, while Palestine was granted to the Zionist movement a year later, when Balfour conveyed the British government's promise, sealing the fate of the Palestine to live in perpetual war and turmoil. Inactive, a century on why Arabs resent Sky Picket. The idea of Western peacemakers and honest brokers, who are very much party in every Middle Eastern conflict, is not new. British betrayal of Arab aspirations goes back to many decades. They used the Arabs as pawns in their great game against other colonial contenders, only to betray them later on, while still casting themselves as friends bearing gifts. Nowhere else was this hypocrisy on full display as was in the case of Palestine. Starting with the first wave of Zionist Jewish migration to Palestine in 1882, European countries helped to facilitate the movement of illegal settlers and resources where the establishment of many colonies, large and small, was afoot. So when the Balfour sent his letter to Rothschild, the idea of the Jewish homeland in Palestine was very much plausible. Still, many supercilious promises were being made to the Arabs during the Great War years as self-imposed Arab leadership sided with the British in their war against the Ottoman Empire. Arabs were promised instant independence, including that of the Palestinians. Wow. They were just given people. I mean, I knew this would come to that just based on what I've been hearing before actually making videos about this, but reading that is actually crazy. The understanding among leadership was not Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations was to apply Arab provinces that were ruled by the Ottomans. Arabs were told they were to be respected as a sacred trust of civilization, and their communities were to be recognized as independent nations. So much for that, jeez. Palestinians wanted to believe they were also included in the civilization's sacredness and were deserving of independence too. Their conduct in support of the Pan-Arab Congress as voting delegates in July 1919, which elected Faisal as a king of state comprising Palestine, Lebanon, Transjordan, and Syria, and their continued support of Sheriff Hussein of Mecca, were all expressions of their desire for the long-coveted sovereignty. When the intentions of the British and their rapport with the Zionists became too apparent, Palestinians rebelled, a rebellion that has never ceased. 99 years later, for the horrific consequences of British colonialism and the eventual complete Zionist takeover of Palestine are still felt after all these years. Partly attempts to pacify Palestinian anger were to no avail, especially after the League of Nations Council in July 1922 approved the terms of the British mandate over Palestine, which was originally granted to Britain in April 1920 without consulting the Palestinians at all, who would disappear from the British and international radar only to reappear as negotiable rioters, troublemakers, and obstacles to the joint British-Zionist colonial concoctions. Despite occasional assurance to the contrary, the British intentions of ensuring the establishment of exclusively Jewish state in Palestine was becoming clear with time. The Balfour Declaration was hardly an aberration, but had, indeed, set the stage for the full-scale ethnic cleansing that followed 3 decades later. In his book, Before the Diaspora, Palestinian scholar Walid Khalid captured the true collective understanding among Palestinians regarding what had befallen their homeland nearly a century ago. Quote, the mandate as a whole was seen by the Palestinians as an Anglo-Zionist condominium and its terms as instruments for the implementation of the Zionist program. It had been imposed on them by force, and they considered it to be both morally and legally invalid. and the Palestinians constituted the vast majority of the populations and owned the bulk of the land. Inevitably, the ensuing struggle centered on the status quo. The British and the Zionists were determined to subvert the revolutionists, to convert and revolutionize the Palestinians to defend and preserve it. I'm pretty sure the Zionists and the British people were pretty much one and the same. Like, they had to be Zionist Britain. Alright. In fact, oh, actually, and so if there's a lot of Palestinians, they might see that as like a threat of like population like overtaking their own. So, you know, there's that. Okay, in fact, the history remains in constant replay. The Zionists claimed Palestine and renamed it Israel. The British continued to support them, although never ceasing to pay lip service to the Arabs. The Palestinian people remain a nation that is geographically fragmented between the refugee camp. In the diaspora, military occupied or treated as second-class citizens in a country upon which their ancestors dwelt since time immemorial. While Balfour cannot be blamed for all the misfortunes that have befallen Palestinians since the communicated his brief but infamous letter, the notion that has promise embodied that of complete disregard of the aspirations of the Palestinians Arab people is handed from one generation of British diplomats to the next, the same way that Palestinian resistance to colonialism is spread across generations. So the Palestinian people are basically just like a hand-me-down colonial project. And unless they're destroyed in our lifetime, they will probably migrate somewhere else, you know, and people will see that as causing havoc, probably. In his essay in Al Aram Weekly entitled Truth and Reconciliation, the late Professor Edward Said wrote, quote, neither the Balfour Declaration nor the Mandate ever specifically concede that Palestinians had political as opposed to civil and religious rights in Palestine. The idea of inequality between Jews and Arabs was therefore built into British and subsequently Israel and U.S. policy from the start. End quote. That inequality continues, thus the perpetuation of the conflict, what the British and the early Zionists, the Americans, and subsequent Israeli governments failed to understand and continue to ignore at their peril is that there can be no peace without justice and inequality in Palestine, and that Palestinians will continue to resist as long as the reasons that inspire their rebellion nearly a century ago remain in place. 100 years later, the British government is yet to possess the moral courage to take responsibility for what their government had done to the Palestinian people. 100 years later, Palestinians insist that their right to in Palestine cannot be dismissed neither by Balfour nor by his modern peers in, quote, Her Majesty's government. Yeah. Okay. Just for disclaimer, Hamas, as I will be reading about them in the next few videos, they are not a revolutionary movement. They are not the good guys. I think even if Israel was gone, they would still have this radicalizational view, you know, because they still use Palestinians as body shields, you know, when in war. So I feel like they almost don't care. All right. I will see you in the next video.